entrepreneurship, arts, and mathematics. We really hope you enjoy it.
Welcome to STEAM Fest 2017. I have no doubt that this room is filled with our nation's next doctors, programmers, artists, teachers, maybe even a governor or a senator or two. As a former teacher, I know that students with science, technology, engineering, arts, and math backgrounds are in high demand. And that's why this opportunity is so important. You get to learn from some of the best and brightest in their fields, and you get to see what opportunities await you as you think about your next steps in life. I'd encourage you to take advantage of every opportunity. Public education is a foundation of our democracy. It opens up doors that wouldn't be possible otherwise. STEAM jobs are some of the fastest growing, good paying jobs in Montana. And that's why it is critical that we provide Montana students with the tools that they need to get an education in STEAM fields. As your senator, I'm working to make higher education more affordable by fighting for stronger Pell Grants to help students better afford the cost of tuition. And I'm supporting the Perkins Loan Program so more students can have access to the education that they need to launch successful careers. It's these kind of investments that will build a brighter future. I hope you get a lot out of this event, and please do stay in touch.
Thank you, Allie. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is a really cool way to do a lecture. So my name is Jedediah Brody. I'm an ecologist and wildlife biologist in the University of Montana, and I do a lot of work in this ecosystem here, which is Borneo and other parts of Southeast Asia. So we're here in Montana. It's wintertime. If we were to go to my study site, we would head out west, out over the Pacific Ocean to this area, which is Southeast Asia. And you can see this group of islands right in the middle. This stretching from Australia up to Asia. This is called the Indo-Malay Archipelago, and that big green island right in the middle is called Borneo, and it exactly straddles the equator. Super hot, super humid, tropical rainforest. And as you've probably heard, like many places in the world, Borneo has gone through a lot of changes in its land cover. So in the 1950s, which is really not that long ago, right? Like that's when my parents were kids. Borneo was almost entirely covered with tropical rainforest. And now it is down to about half of that cover. So a lot of it has been logged and converted to agriculture. And one of the big agricultural products that we see, this picture on the bottom here, this is called oil palm. And the oil palm trees are native to Africa, but they've taken them and they grow them in these huge, expansive monocultures across Borneo, just like we do soy or corn in the middle of North America. And so we take this super diverse, intact rainforest and convert it to a simple monoculture. And of course, that's going to have a lot of impacts on the wildlife that used to live in that rainforest. So one of the things I really want to find out is how these land use changes affect wildlife. So what we do is we hike out into the jungle, and I do this with my family. You can see us here camping in in this case, not super comfortable conditions. This is not glamping at all. So we're staying in little tarps. That's my, at the time, 3-year-old kid and my wife and our local guides. So we hike out into the jungle, and we're setting up these things, which are camera traps. And some of you guys might know about these from hunting, but this is a camera trap. It's a remote triggered camera, so it takes batteries inside of it, and then you close it up, you attach it to a tree, and it's rainproof, and you just leave it out in the jungle for, in some cases, half a year. And it's triggered by motion, so whenever an animal walks in front of it, we get a picture of it. And so we do this all over the place.
Jedediah, I'm curious, really quickly. Let's just do a quick poll of all the students. How many of you have used a camera like this for hunting or for other purposes? Show of hands. Anybody? A couple of you.
Couple.
All
They're
right.
super fun. When you pick one of these up after it being out in the jungle for half a year, it's like Christmas morning. You just open it up and it's full of surprises, right? You never know what kind of animals are going to be on here. And the other really important piece of fancy scientific field equipment we use is this thing, which is a parang or a machete. And this is literally one of the most important pieces of scientific equipment that I have. So we go out in the jungle, we set up these camera traps, we do it in old growth forest, in logged forest, in oil palm plantations, all over the place, and then we can figure out where different animals are going and where they're living. So some of the animals in Borneo are things that are kind of similar to what you guys might be familiar with here. We've got deer like this one. This is a sambar deer, which is kind of related to an elk. And then we've got bears. These are sun bears. But then, of course, a lot of other animals are really different. So we've got elephants. This thing down here is called a civet. It's a different kind of carnivore. Looks a little bit like a cat or a raccoon, but it's not really too closely related to them. And then this one, this is called the clouded leopard. This is one of the main species I study. Super cool, really beautiful animal. And I've got a skull of a clouded leopard here. So you can see the teeth on this thing are just super long relative to the size of this skull. So this is almost like our last living saber-toothed cat. It's a really neat animal. So we get all this data. We use these cameras to actually collect scientific data. And then the idea is to figure out what kind of habitats they need, and then to figure out where we need to put habitat corridors. So a habitat corridor is just a strip of forest, in this case, that connects, for example, two national parks. So you imagine here in Montana, you've got, Glacier National Park, Yellowstone National Park. If you wanted animals to be able to move between those parks, then they would need some natural habitat to move through. So that's what we're trying to do in Borneo, is set aside strips of forest so the clouded leopards and the elephants and the civets can move among all the different parks and find mates, find food, get out of the way of rising temperatures from climate change, all of that. And then what we end up doing, what I really want to do is be getting dirty in the jungle, but when it comes to doing conservation, it's just as important to put on my suit and tie and go into the meetings with the politicians and the policymakers and the public and explain why we're doing what we're doing, what we've found, what our results say about where habitat corridors are really important, and so try to reach out to the people making land use decisions that way. So, thank you for listening, and I'm going to turn it over to my friend Dr. Nick de Cesar, who's going to talk about wildlife a little bit closer to home.
I'm wondering if we could do some questions before
Sure.
we turn it over.
We certainly can.
Okay, so Dr. Brody goes to Malaysia and studies clouded leopards. That's pretty awesome, and does a lot of really important work. I'm wondering, let's start. I'm going to go through each of the schools that we have today on camera, and I'm going to start with Cut Bank and see if you have any questions for Dr. Brody. So, okay, you'll unmute your microphone.
Just click the button.
Keenan? Do you enjoy your job?
Yeah, that.
I have the best job I could possibly imagine. I love my job. Yeah.
What's
Have
your
you ever
favorite part?
trapped with clouded leopards?
What was the question?
Have you ever been able to trap and study them?
No. So, interestingly, so that's something that wildlife biologists do a lot in North America, and we might even hear Nick talk about that. That's not as nearly as common in the tropics. It's just really, really hard to find these animals. So I've studied clouded leopards for probably 7 years now. I've seen one once, the whole time. I've seen one clouded leopard. So it's the kind of thing where even 10, 20 years ago, we couldn't have studied this animal. It just would have been impossible. But nowadays, with these camera traps that I showed you, that's just completely revolutionized how we can study these really rare, secretive, elusive creatures.
Awesome. Let's go over to Conrad. Conrad, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I got one. I was wondering if maybe you, on your trips, do you discover new species or plants on your trips?
Yeah, good question. I haven't discovered any new animals. There probably aren't many new mammals, new to science, left in at least Borneo. But I've kind of been on expeditions that have discovered some new plants for sure. Yeah, there's a lot of plants out there that haven't been discovered, and a lot of insects too, and other creatures that I don't really know that much about. But yeah, it's a pretty neat place to work for that reason.
Do you just study mammals? Or
Yeah, so I study mammals and plants and interactions between mammals and plants, where a lot of the trees in the jungle produce these fleshy fruits that require things like mammals or birds to eat them and disperse the seeds. So I study those mammal-plant interactions as well.
cool, thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Conrad, do you have anyone else with questions?
Nope, I don't think so.
Great. Let's go over to Lame Deer. Lame Deer, do you have any questions for Dr. Brody?
Hi, guys.
Okay. Good morning. Can you hear us?
Yeah, we can. Morning.
Good morning, girls. There's a couple of questions here. Go ahead. Don't be shy now.
Where is like, I mean, where?
Oh gosh.
How long have you been working?
Did you hear that?
How long have I been working? Well, I started working in Borneo after I finished college, so that was actually kind of a surprisingly long time ago. That was 20 years ago or more. That was 20 years ago. Yeah, 20 years ago I started working in Borneo.
Ask me where you went to college.
Oh, this is. You ask him. This is Adrian Keels. I'm the sponsor for our science club here.
Cool.
I had done some grad research on myself, camera trapping for a culturally significant animal for our tribe, the Northern Cheyenne tribe. And it was a swift fox study. And this assessment that I did was I did 36 surveys for the Northern Cheyenne tribe back in 2011 and 12. And you're right. It was nice finding every 3 days that I'd pick up the cameras. I ran on 6 different transects on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in habitat that would likely have the swift fox. And apparently the study here was that we were trying to connect the population, the northern population, to the southern population. And I'm not sure if you have your your assessment and all your information. We collected a lot of animals on ours as well. Even as far as, a lot of the data showed we have a lot of livestock and then dogs, wild dogs. And so that information told us a lot too on what was here. And does it mean the swift fox are not here? It might be likely that, the habitat, you're right, it's huge in restoring and developing some kind of conservation measures for their habitat. And so I'm not like where your location is. It seems like it's more like, is it jungle like? We don't know. The students don't know much about it. Tropical, obviously. And so running transects would seem a little difficult but if you went to, I don't know how many you ran or what, but
Yeah. Yeah, those are great questions. That sounds like a super cool study. I read a bit about some of the swift fox research that you guys and other people have been doing. It's just awesome. What an amazing animal. And yeah, it's cool to hear that you've been using camera traps because they're just so fun. And it's such a powerful scientific research tool. Yeah, you're right. It's all about habitat. And when we talk about habitat corridors, of course, that's going to really depend on what the species is that we're talking about. So of course swift foxes are going to require very, very different habitat than any of the species that I study. So the habitat in Borneo is thick, tall, tropical jungle. So the trees get up to 120, 150 feet tall, and in a really tall forest like that, then the understory can be kind of open, so you can walk around through amongst these giant trees. But in a logged area where the giant trees have been taken away and more light comes through, then it's super thick, and that's really where you need the machete to get through. And so for my work with the cameras, I've done about I want to say 500 or 600 camera stations in different places. And it's not always on exact transects, but I have done transects for some of my plant work. And you're right, it's really hard in a rainforest. I mean, if you want to walk a straight line through the rainforest, I basically have to take my backpack off and take my compass and just get on my hands and knees and crawl and just kind of slither through the jungle like a snake. It's really thick.
Awesome. And then let's just go to Ronan. Ronan, do you have any questions for Dr. Brody?
In your video, you're talking about leeches. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, the leeches are really cool, and I didn't point that out in my talk, but some of you might have noticed that when I was the picture of me putting that camera trap up, I had these tall socks on, and then the picture of my kid, even he had these little these well, big for him, but these socks on that come up to his knees. And those are leech socks, and so I make those myself just out of cotton. And you put them inside your shoes and then outside your pants, and you spray them with insect repellent, because they're, in Montana we're used to thinking about leeches living in water, but in Southeast Asia they live on land, and they're everywhere, especially in the rainy season when it's wet. You can just kind of stand there and look around, and the jungle floor is creeping towards you from all directions, and it's awesome. I mean, you don't really want them climbing up on you and sucking too much blood, because you need your blood, and because it's really itchy. But in general, I actually do really dig the leeches. There's so many of them, and they're so interesting, and I think they're a really important part of the ecosystem. But I've had them in sucking blood on parts of my body that I don't want to tell you about.
Ronan, do you have any other questions?
Where else have you studied, besides Borneo?
I've done a lot of work in Alaska as well, which is obviously pretty different from Borneo. I've done some work in Namibia on rhinos, which is southern Africa, and a little bit in South Asia, so Nepal and Thailand. Well, that's Southeast Asia, but Thailand. Worked a lot in the western U.S., so I did quite a few studies in Yellowstone National Park and parts of Idaho, California. So a lot of different places. There's just so many cool places to explore.
Wonderful. We're going to go ahead and bring Nick de Cesar on from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to talk a little bit about his experiences in Montana. So we're just going to switch this over. Whoop. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Nick de Cesar. I live here in Missoula, but I work for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, for FWP, for the last 5 years. And when they hired me mainly to study these guys, to study moose in Montana. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing and kind of give you an example of the kind of projects that I get to work on working for Montana here. And also, I guess I wanted to start by just commenting about, wildlife biology as a whole. And I think, especially in places like Montana, where a lot of us grow up surrounded by the outdoors, and that's kind of how I grew up, it's hard not to develop a really kind of personal passion and interest in nature. And so getting to have a job like this in science, and specifically in the science of wild animals and nature, it's really cool and a real fun way to spend your life. The other part that I didn't really think about, my kind of selfish thing was, well, gosh, if I could have a job working in nature, that sounds great. The other part I didn't really think about is sort of what is nature to everybody else, and really in America especially, all the animals are legally owned by the public. So all of you guys, everybody owns those animals. And so when you work for a outfit like I do for the state, really what we are is we're just the stewards or kind of the managers of those wildlife that you guys own. So what my job is essentially is I'm serving you. I'm just supposed to try to do what I can to help us keep these animals and keep nature sort of out there for everybody to enjoy. And really it brings people into our jobs a lot more than we kind of think when we're going into it. We go into this field thinking about animals, but we end up with this really cool role to play for everybody to kind of be the ones that get to think about animals and try to do what we can to protect them, but in sort of a public setting where we're responsible to all of you. So it's a neat job for that reason too, besides just our own personal interests. And so to start, this is kind of a little trivia question for you about moose. And so I don't know if you guys want to see, who can get it right out there. Talk amongst yourselves. So let's say it's winter. I had to cover these moose heads up so you can't see, but let's say it's winter and the antlers have fallen off, and you go out there and you see a big moose in the winter. How do you know if it's a bull or a cow, if it's a male or a female?
Okay, I want everybody to turn and talk, and then we're going to go through the schools really quickly to come have one person go ahead and tell us which one you think. So we'll differentiate between the one with snow on the ground versus no snow. So I'll give you 15 seconds. All right, let's start with Rodan. Rodan, which one do you think is the bull? Snow or no snow?
Snow.
Okay, we've got snow for Ronan. Conrad, what do you think?
No snow.
No snow. Okay, 1 and 1. Lame deer, what do you think?
No.
Snow.
Snow. 2 for snow, 1 for no snow.
Right.
And then Cutbank, what do you think?
No snow.
Ooh.
Oh, it's a tie.
Is that everybody?
That's everybody, yep.
2-2. Okay. Well, let's imagine this is one of those, when you're a kid and they have those pictures and you say, what's different about these two things? So look at these 2 pictures. Besides the snow, if you just look at the moose, what's different?
All right.
You see this little white patch? See if I can find it right there. See that little white spot? Only the females have that little white spot. That's the only way you can tell them apart in the winter. It's called a vulva patch, but it's just a little white patch. So when the antlers are gone, that's how you can tell if it's a cow or a bull. And so just imagine if you're a moose biologist and you're in a plane flying over to count your moose, and that's how you can tell. You're trying to see that little white spot on every moose so you can tell how many bulls are out there and how many cows. So that's some of the joys of being a moose biologist, looking for those little white spots. Okay, so why are we talking about moose at all? Well, this map is just a range of where moose are in North America, and so they range really widely across basically the boreal forests of Canada and Alaska, and then they kind of dip down into the U.S. in Minnesota, New York, and then here in the Rockies, through Montana, Idaho, Colorado. So you see that little piece of the range that's kind of sticking down into where our neck of the woods. But really up here, this is most of where moose country is. And so these little red dots are some places where people have looked at, well, how are the moose doing along kind of the southern edge of where they exist. And the red dots are places where we think moose are declining, blue places where we're actually seeing increases in moose. So some of the folks, if you guys are living or spending time out in eastern Montana, that's actually one place where we're seeing more moose than we used to, even in the last few years, kind of moose coming out of Canada and filling in some of that prairie country in eastern Montana, which is really interesting. But what you kind of notice is there's a general trend of a lot of red dots here. And so there's a lot of concern about declines in moose populations, especially in this kind of southern area where we find them. So in Montana, we have lots of questions about what's going on with moose there. And so there's lots of possible things that could be going on. We're affecting moose with hunting. There's more predators in parts of Montana than there maybe used to be a few decades ago, so that's been changing. We've got differences in sort of the things that moose eat, different ways that we're managing the forests, and just changes that are going on out there that may or may not be affecting moose. And then if you're a moose, not only do you have to deal with all these guys, but you have to deal with other things like parasites, ticks that are trying to get on you all winter long, and these worms that are trying to get into your blood. And then we've got sort of changing climates for an animal that really lives in places like Alaska. if you can imagine, if climate's changing in Montana, then it might be making it harder for moose to find those sort of Alaska-like places down here in Montana. And so lots of questions there. And then the other thing to think about with moose specifically is Montana is really not a moose ecosystem. It's really an ecosystem of all these guys: deer, white-tailed deer, mule deer, and elk. And so these are just numbers of how many hunters are successful at getting an elk or a deer every year. So 25 to 40,000 of each of those animals per year, compared to just a few hundred moose. And so there's moose throughout Montana, but there's really not that many. And this just kind of gives you a sense of the scale of moose are living in a place that's really driven by these guys. And that's different when you go up into Canada and Alaska. Then moose become the big player. And so when you in Montana and there's only a few moose out there and you want to go count them, this is what you're trying to see a moose through in the forest. It's not like elk where they all go into an open country in the winter and you can just kind of count them one by one. So it's really difficult. Not only are there not that many of them, but they're just really difficult to study. And so that kind of is what led us to this question of, well, what's going on? We need to take a closer look. We can't just go kind of count how many there are. And so that's where my job kind of starts, is with this research project that's really just about trying to take a closer look at moose on behalf of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And so what we did is try to design a study where we could pick a few places and a few individual animals and just learn as much as we can. And so this is a picture of being out in a helicopter and using tranquilizer darts to actually catch a sample of moose and then really try to learn a whole bunch. And so what we did is we picked some areas, different parts of the state. Some of these are closer or farther for home for some of you guys, but as you can probably imagine, they're very different places. The Cabinets up in northwest Montana, really forested, wet place. The Big Hole Valley down in southwest is this kind of, willow country, high elevation. And then out on the east front, which is kind of part of that eastern range for moose, where we're actually seeing more than we used to. And so sort of three different places where we think there might be three different stories going on. And then we tried to actually catch a bunch of moose and start the study. And so I have on this, let me get out of the way here. I have on this slide here that adult females are the key. And so we really focus on cow moose for this study because they're the ones that are really responsible for growing more moose each year. And if you think about it, for an animal like a moose, the bulls are really just there to help to get the cows pregnant each year to grow new animals. And so we start with the cows, and we kind of look for three different things about what, in a good moose population, what they should be doing. And so they should be living a long time. So they're supposed to live 10 to 15 years and be able to have babies each year. So they should be living a long time. They should be in good enough condition that they're able to get pregnant every year. And then when those calves are hitting the ground in the spring, they should be able to raise them for a full year to become their own adults and kind of recruit into the population. So these are the things with this moose study that we're trying to learn about, is sort of how are they living a long time? Are they in good enough shape to get pregnant every year? And how are those calves doing? And so just a few examples of some of the things we've learned so far. Are they living a long time? It kind of depends on where you look, but we've had this one surprise where in one of those study areas, we're actually seeing a lot of these cow moose dying and not getting killed by predators necessarily, which is what usually is the story with moose across Canada and Alaska, but they're actually getting killed by something else, some sort of a health-related or disease-related thing. So instead of going out there and when a moose dies, having it just be consumed by wolves or by bears or something, we're finding these animals that in Minnesota they call it tip-over disease. They're essentially, they look like they just tipped over. And so what's going on there? And one idea we've had since this started happening is that this little guy up here, this is a ball of arterial worms. So these are worms that are they're about the size of a moose hair. They're 5-6 inches long, really skinny, like a angel hair pasta. And essentially what they do is get into the bloodstream of moose, and then they live in those carotid arteries, and they just reproduce in there. And so this is a bundle of worms that came out of one artery of one of these moose. And so that's something we're trying to learn more about. Are these worms actually responsible for what we're seeing here? So as we start this study, we kind of start with these real basic questions, and then we get some new questions as we go. Another thing, are they getting pregnant every year? And so we don't need to focus on the numbers here, but what we're trying to learn is sort of roughly across these 3 areas, we have most of them are getting pregnant. So about 4 out of every 5 are getting pregnant. And then a batch of those, sometimes the calves are getting killed right away. And so we have some percentage of those where the calves are really being born healthy. And then there's these pieces with moose where some of them can have twins and some of them just have 1 calf a year. So all this sort of adds up to what we're seeing here, which is what proportion of the animals are actually giving birth to a calf every year. And we're starting to see some variation in our study areas here, where in one place on the east front, 4 out of every 5 of those moose have a calf in the spring, whereas up in the cabinets, it's about half. So you can imagine that really affects how a population is doing if they're able to really grow calves each year versus not. And then the last piece of it is, so along those lines, there's another story with, are you getting pregnant or not? And so I mentioned these parasites. Another parasite we see on moose is winter ticks. So they're kind of like wood ticks that we get on in the summer, but they live in the winter. And essentially, if you're a moose in a place with a lot of ticks, they end up getting, this is a picture of probably about 15 ticks in maybe a square inch on their hide. And they can end up with 10, 20, 30,000 of these ticks on their bodies. And so that's a big cost to them in terms of their blood. And then they end up scratching all their hair off, just scratching ticks all winter long. So this is a moose in April, essentially after all that winter, when it went through, just what it is to be a moose in the winter. And not only are there all those challenges, but it doesn't have any hair left in the meantime. So you can imagine there's some questions there about, is that causing a problem for some of our moose? So this is a moose out on the east front a couple years ago. The last thing is about the calves, and again, the numbers aren't really important, but what we're seeing is this is sort of, if you start with all your calves through the year, and as these lines go down, that's how many calves are you left with at the end of the year. And so if you started with 100 calves in each of these 3 study areas, in one of them you end with 60, and in one of them you only end with 30. So 70 out of 100 calves are dying during that first year. And usually when that's going on, that's often either a nutritional problem for those calves, or it could be something else going on with changes in predator populations. So as much as we like to collar and study animals in North America, we're trying to catch up to what Jedediah is doing and learning something about how to use some of these trail cameras to learn about our carnivores in these moose study areas too. And so just a sense of some of what we're trying to do, and as you can imagine, all these things are really kind of creating more and more questions of trying to really get to the bottom of what's going on, and it just gets super complicated, but also really exciting for us to try to learn and then put ourselves in a place where we can actually do something for these animals in the long run. And so this is a 10-year project. So we're in, let's see, about year 4 of that timeline, and lots to get to learn and find out about these animals in the next 6 years that we have left. On the FWP page, there's these tabs. I was just going to show you how, if you're interested in more info about this or other FWP projects, there's this Fish and Wildlife tab, and way down at the bottom there's a wildlife research link, and you can go there and find kind of links to pictures, videos, reports about some of the different research we're doing, this moose project, but lots of other projects. So lots of other stuff out there on that page, which is kind of fun. And that's all I had, and I'll leave you with, this is a moose that we collared in the east front. This is from the Blackleaf WMA, kind of by Shoto, just northwest of Shoto. And this moose actually spent last summer down by Butte. It went all the way down to Butte for the summer, and then it went up back along the front, went right through Conrad, just east of Conrad, and then now it's up in southeast Alberta. And so another thing we're learning about that isn't really what we set out to study is some of the movements that we're seeing, and sort of what is our moose population relative to all the places around us, Canada and other parts of Montana, and trying to better understand really where are these animals all coming from and going. So fun stuff.
Thank you, Nick. So I want to open it up to questions just like we did with Dr. Brody. Let's go ahead and start with Lame Deer. Lame Deer, do you have some questions?
Where'd you go?
Sorry. Are there questions?
So wait, where is the main habitat they usually go to?
What kind of habitat do they have?
Yeah, that's a good question. Usually it starts, they like to eat young trees and shrubs, and so it depends on where you can find that. So in southern Montana, it's oftentimes it'd be big willow bottoms, like along creeks, where you see those real dense shrub fields that grow along a creek. That's often where you find them in southwest Montana. But up by Libby or in northwest Montana, where it's all just forest, usually where you find moose there is places where they've logged. So if you've logged a big area and then the trees are just starting to grow back and shrubs are growing back, like if you picture walking into a clear cut that's like 10 years old or something, in that part of the state, that's really good habitat. So it can vary, but really what they want is sort of shrubs and young trees. That's essentially what they eat. Any other thoughts, questions?
Radio caller. It's a radio caller. He was telling about it.
Can that choke him or something?
It's tracking him. It's a tracking device.
Like a good healthy.
Hey guys, quiet. He can't hear him. Say it again.
How long does that usually live?
Did you hear the question?
I didn't. Yeah, could you repeat it?
Say it again.
How long does usually a good healthy bull live?
How long do they live?
How long? Yeah.
Yeah. I think the oldest. So we can age them from teeth, and so we do ask all the hunters to send us the teeth when they harvest a moose. And I think the oldest one we've had so far was 17. The cows usually live a little bit longer, so I think a cow probably lives on average to be about 14 or 15, and a bull more like 10 to 12. But I think there are cases of them getting to be 20 or something like that. But I think in their early teens is about average.
Great.
Yeah.
Let's go over to Conrad. Conrad, do you have some questions? Have you seen this moose, Conrad? That's my question
Yeah.
for you.
Did you guys see it?
Have you guys seen moose around here?
I haven't seen any moose around here.
Hunter, you've seen some. Anybody have a question? Evidently no questions. They say they have seen some moose around, but no questions. So
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's go down to Cutbank.
Why did you want to study moose out of all animals?
Well, that's a fair question, and I was actually looking at some of the information online. I think they say there's over 500 species of mammals or vertebrates in Montana, and so there's more than we could ever learn about any one of these animals. And so I think it starts with some of the animals where our agency is funded primarily by fishermen and hunters, and so we start with trying to make sure we're doing a good job of managing those animals that really pay our bills. And moose, unfortunately, aren't one of them, but they are something that captures a lot of attention. And so there's been a growing interest in this animal for, I think it's been about 20 years. They've been wanting to do a study on moose. And I think what happened is essentially those red dots on the map started to happen in other places, and that sort of pushed us into it. Well, we really need to learn something. And so there's also a little bit of funding that's earmarked for moose because of the way that hunting dollars are managed. So we have some money that's dedicated just for moose research or management, and that makes them an animal that we can afford to study. But unfortunately, there's always cost to other studies we could be doing for other species. So that's a really good question.
What do you study any other animals?
Yeah, it's kind of fun. The job that I have is it's basically just to do research that helps us manage wildlife in Montana. And so this has been this is kind of my main job in terms of if I'm doing a good job, this project is going well. But I've been able to help out with some other, mostly big game studies, but working on some mule deer projects, a little bit of work on how wolves are affecting livestock in Montana. We're trying to review a bunch of information about mountain goats right now to see if something similar to what we're doing for moose is needed for learning more about mountain goats in Montana. And then before I got this job, I used to work for other, like the Forest Service and other groups where we worked on bighorn sheep and lynx and wolves and caribou and things mostly just in Montana and Alberta, kind of in this area. So it's it's another reason that this is a fun job, because you build the skill sets, and then you get to sort of work on whatever is the most important. But ultimately, kind of where I started at the beginning, that thing about being really a resource for the public, that's where some of the work that I do really it should be, if I'm doing a good job, it should be decided by what are the questions that the public really wants the answers to.
Great. Rodan, do you have any questions?
Which predators do the most damage to moose?
It actually, it's surprising how much it can vary. For adult moose, most of what can kill adult moose is wolves, and pretty much everywhere where you find moose throughout Canada, Alaska, moose they live in Russia and into Scandinavia too, and everywhere where moose exist, pretty much wolves exist. So they kind of have a hand-in-hand balance that I think, they're over time they affect each other for sure. And so wolves are a big part of the moose story almost anywhere you go. Some of the interesting stuff though is how you'll see studies where individual mountain lions get a taste for moose, and you'll have an individual lion or two that really focuses on moose. Or in parts of Alaska, I talked about the survival of the adults and the survival of the calves, and that calf piece can really be affected by bears. So either both black bears and brown bears can really affect moose populations just in that first month of the calves' life, when those calves first hit the ground. Some bear populations really focus on moose at that time. So it's certainly something. Predators are kind of an important part of what it is to be a moose pretty much everywhere they exist, but which predators and when can really vary.
What kind of nutritional problems do they have?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Good question. It's in places like Alaska, it's really a lot easier to learn things like that, because you'll have places where it's pretty much moose and willows, and you can study how the willows go up, the moose go up, the willows go down, the moose go down, and you'll see these kind of cycles of essentially not only how much food there is for them, but what's the quality of the food, like how nutritious is it. And so there are parts of Alaska where moose are really adapted for that world, and you'll see super healthy populations where almost all the cows are giving birth to twins every year, and the willows are really healthy, and that's kind of the best place to be a moose on a given time. But down here in Montana, it can be really complicated, because what they're eating can really vary. We have some moose keying on willows. Up in Libby, they're eating huckleberries and ceanothus, lots of different shrub species, and so it can be really tricky to tease out which of those plants is really, sometimes we call it just the ice cream, sort of the stuff they really like to eat, but it's not really giving them what they need in terms of the year-round survival, and then which plants are really the ones that are driving the population ultimately. And so, to be honest, here in Montana, I can't answer that question very well, but that's partly why we're doing this. So yeah, a really good question.
Excellent. Well, we're about out of time today. I do, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to bring both Jedediah and Nick, and wonderful. And first of all, I want to thank both of you for coming into the studios today. And students, if you join me in thanking them. Yay! Thank you. There we go. And then I have just one last question for both of you. If I am a student in high school in Montana, and I'm interested in becoming a wildlife biologist and either going to the University of Montana or maybe working for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks one day, what do I need to do?
Well, I don't think that's an either-or kind of thing for sure. The University of Montana, if you're interested in wildlife, the University of Montana was just ranked the top wildlife program in all of North America. So it's a great place to do wildlife biology. And I think a lot of our people, including Nick, who did his PhD at the University of Montana, go on to work for FWP.
Yeah, it's a really, the just getting out there, shaking hands with people, especially here in Montana. Just making connections is one way to get your foot in the door with FWP specifically, but I think some of the greatest advice I got in terms of how to land where you want to in this field is to start with school, go at the university, and sort of the more you can focus on that, you ultimately put yourself in a place to kind of do whatever you want. And so, and it's fortunate that here in Montana we have the luxury of having the best program in the nation to be able to do that. So it's kind of a win-win to be able to jump right into that program.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, you guys, again, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that we might see some of your classes back again for more of our STEAM Fest events. And thank you again, both of you.
Thank you guys.
Thanks,
Thanks everybody.
Wonderful.